We have Shervin Majd, who is the CPO and VP of AI at Footura Inc. Footura is an AI-driven health and fitness coaching app. Shervin's going to share his talk on the three overlooked seeds of innovation adoption DNA, which is layer-specific communication, cross-layer engagement, and agility robustness. I think in a word, we're talking about partnerships. Is that fair, Shervin?
That's definitely a big component of it, yes. But I think I'm basically covering this as something that the startups need to kind of get used to it from day one. I appreciate it, John. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here and sharing some of the learnings in the past 20 years with you. A little bit about myself. I've been in healthcare innovation for the past 20 years. I've done work in biomedical research and medical devices, and the past 15 years have been formally working in the interface of software and healthcare, both as investor, corporate VC, and angel, working with a group in the Bay Area called Life Science Angels. And on the full-time side, I've been doing work more as a product lead for digital health solutions across a number of groups. Past 7, 8 years, I've also tried to push for scaling innovation, which is the challenge for especially for mid to large enterprises. I had a chance to work for a large health system and kind of test some of the ideas to fight the odds of scaling innovation, and also that followed with another experience with a SaaS company selling software solutions in this domain to a different range of entities from state, county to government, and trying to test some of those ideas. Today, I'm sharing three of those critical ones, and hopefully that's valuable. Happy to kind of address any questions in the end and go through each item maybe a little bit in more depth. For the first two slides, I'll talk a little bit about why adoption and scale DNA is important, and you need to pay attention to that. Most startups hit a tipping point where early design decisions start to look like technical debt. You see a graphic here where at rough kind of a high level view, you see 4 stages of growth for your journey as a startup: ideation, MVP launch, commercial launch, and growth and scale. And I also put some timelines plus maybe an example risk factor there. But we start with maybe a couple of questions to sort of set the stage here, where we kind of should think about where exactly do ideation and MVP growth begin and end for our own products. When we think about the first 2 stages, pre-MVP, how fast is truly agile? We've been getting a lot of teachings, I think, about agile being important. I'm a firm believer of that. I've been using a Scrum for the past 15 years myself. But at the same time, what is the right speed? Where do you need to mix it with other strategic elements, and how that balance changes? How early should you bake launch and scale requirements? And finally, again, how do we hardwire scale and adoption DNA from day one? So the word balance is something that, as I work more and more in the startup or again enterprise side, I get to it as a critical point, as much as it's valuable for your personal life as well. But basically, that the balance between the agile and scale is something that you have to keep monitoring it as you start the work. Very high level view of that. I mean, this is just some example numbers I put here just to set the point, and that's different potentially for product, vertical. Things can be changing, but again, you early on you have to be heavily focused on agile, but you still have some room potentially to pay attention to scalability. You move to 70%, and then later maybe 50%, and of course with your scale and growth, agile plays probably a smaller role as you get slower by nature, and then a lot of other components play a big role which are coming from the scale. And if on the graphic side you see how the DNA we're referring to is kind of getting built up by the combination of agile and the scale components. I'm sure you know about the elements of agile. Most of you have dealt with this in the startup world. But on the scale side, yeah, I think a lot of elements such as modular architecture designs, security foundations, performance monitoring, overall data monitoring and measurement of the system at each step of the way is critical. And those are some examples. And I think the high level suggestion is to ensure that you do a quarterly check on this balance we're talking about, to ensure you're not missing a major point on the scalability of your product. That is critical. And the question is not just, are we being agile enough? That's a valid question. You should ask that question every day. There is another question that is also important. Are we being strategically agile for our next growth phase? In one way or the other, you have to be ahead of your game, and you have to know how things are going on and kind of plan for that. Let's talk about those three key areas. This is not, the complete list. It's a long list of actions when you want to sort of achieve sustainable adoption. And there's not really a secret sauce to me. I believe that you have to pay attention to a lot of elements of risk. But these are the three areas that are not getting enough attention, despite the fact that on the surface, everybody's talking about it. But on the action side, the efforts are kind of not to the level that is required. And I'm emphasizing those points today. The first one is layer specific communication, or what I call avoid the fear of unknown. One statistic here, 86% of employees and executives cite poor communication as the main cause of project failure. That's the general kind of data, even for large organizations, irrespective of partnerships. But if you want to work with a partner, and I'm emphasizing on the point that John alluded to just now, where partnership does not necessarily mean when you have your MVP or product. If you need to do some research, understanding your end users, do some UX research, run some interviews, those are also the initial kind of aspects of the partnership you need to plan for and emphasize. And that's what it means, kind of why we need to pay attention to the scalability and the scale. A lot of times the stumble when basically one of the layers you deal with or stakeholders, they don't have a clarity on what's in it for me narrative. And that's where things can get really difficult and friction points increase. And this is what I'm referring to fear of unknown, because if a layer of organization doesn't understand what you're doing, they would generally assume the worst case scenario, which is the product is not ready, they're going to waste my time, learning curve is very challenging, and things of that nature. And that's going to be potentially a major blocker for your progress. The other thing that we are talking here is that make sure you understand the language of the stakeholder you're talking to. The CEOs care about the ROI, nurses, care about patient outcomes, and IT admin cares about the security. And that's critical to sort of be very mindful and understand that all these burdens on the shoulder of the startup leads and CEOs and pre-sales leads that are doing these conversations, and you cannot expect the customer to do all of that work on their own end, because they're already busy, they're bombarded with millions of ideas and a lot of free pilots, especially in healthcare. And that's why you need to sort of help them to achieve the why component. In terms of just the simple steps, again, as I'm saying, is we are surfacing these domains here. They're definitely deeper than what I'm covering today, but just to start the point, make sure you map the personas of customers and the stakeholders you work with, potentially craft outcome-based message metrics, leverage short impactful videos, summaries, pamphlets, or PDFs that you want to share with them to ensure that they get the point quickly, and try to do some pulse surveys, on clarity and relevance as you move on to work with these guys to see if your approach is working. If not, make sure you make the adjustments to potentially improve the situation. The second topic is very tightly relevant to first one, but I just want to emphasize that it's very common that startups has to find out who's paying for their product and the main customer. Is it CEO? Is it my chief medical officer? Is it chief financial officer? And that's completely a fair and important task. But at the same time, this does not mean that if the CEO of an entity, even a major entity, has the full buy-in of my solution, I'm going to be successful, and everybody in that organization is going to just work on this product to get successful adoption. And that's completely the opposite. A lot of examples that I've seen, and they exist if you do the research, shows that basically the communication and engagement with middle management and frontline users or end users are really missing, and that's important to pay significant attention. Another way to kind of super simplify this is executive buy-in gets you in the door, middle management and frontline users of course keeps you there. And this is very important to think of engagement as vertical as you go from the executives to frontline and end users, but also a lot of times you have to be mindful of the horizontal and peer champions, and that kind of depends on the product situation and verticals as well. To kind of give you some starting points, identify the champions for every end users or every 15 end users you have, and within each layer, make sure you have the right champions for each layer. And these are the folks that truly believe in your solution, and they are generally try to help the cause, and especially in healthcare, helping patients. And of course, some of them could be also seeing the right angle for your product to improve the ROI, margins, or things of that nature. So finding them, building the relationship, working together with them is critical. The other thing you can do to the degree that timing allows is to try to co-design some workshop with the end users and managers and make it to your onboarding or pre-sales or discovery phases, depending on whatever kind of engagement you have with them. This allows you to better understand the current workflows, current pain points, and see things from their perspective. And also on the other side, to show them and work together with them to identify how your product make things and make their life easier. This is very important and critical, and that's just talking back to the fine-tuning the engagement as well as fine-tuning the conversation and working very closely with them. And finally, making sure that you give credit to folks that are working on this. Public kudos, making sure executive shout outs, the managers or top managers understand, who's really doing the work. And also you can go a little bit more and do some micro grants and help them with some of the challenges. If they need let's say, small tablet and that it needs 6 month approval, you can potentially provide it with the approval of the group as it's less than typical procurement, kind of a level, and make their life easier as part of the grant or clinical trial or whatever you're doing with the group together. And finally, the third point is about agility and robustness balance. Just to make sure this is not confused with my overarching need to attention to scale. Here, I'm mostly pushing on the technical robustness and the fact that from day one, you need to kind of pay attention to ensure that your platform is scalable. And a scalable is different than building the full-fledged scaled solutions or scalable solution from day one. It's just important to make sure you build it in a way that later you don't have to rebuild this platform from scratch and everything becomes, a throwaway. 70% of healthcare digital transformations miss objectives. That's just some of the figures and statistics that you should pay attention to. A lot of these problems kind of go back to these semi-obvious points that are not getting the right action or on the field. And that's why I'm kind of emphasizing that. Fast pilots, and we're talking about things that are, faster than usual, meaning you haven't done the right work around security, integration, uptime. Those are some examples that need, the right attention at the right time. And then potentially it's increasing with the, with your product maturity. Overall, you need to kind of make sure you have a rhythm of building, validating, harden, and replicate that process every couple of, let's say, month or so, and ensure that you're on top of the needs around technical robustness as much as you're pushing for, agility. Yeah, I think some of this is probably familiar to you. Yeah, build your product prototype, test it and validate with actual users and end users. Success metrics is very important. A lot of groups are kind of paying a half-baked attention to that. Doing data-driven work is helpful for troubleshooting, for fine-tuning, for benchmarking and improvement, and also is critical for your customers to get a sense of why we're doing this and how things are getting better. And a lot of times customers may not have the current benchmark on their own side. And that's also on your shoulder to sort of set the stage for them and kind of show them how things are getting better with your product. And then, examples of what you need to do with your platform. A lot of times, you need to make sure you do load testing and ensure that your platform is probably okay for the next, 6 months ahead of this project. And you don't have a problem with, let's say, potentially a great adoption and, that is going very fast and you don't run into a trouble. And this is very important to build trust with the potential customer and maintain that trust, because if that trust is lost, it's very difficult to bring it back to the table. And it's very challenging. And once you get to this cycle, I think it's important to sort of embed it as part of your deployment playbook. So with that, this is basically my last slide, or maybe one to the last, which is kind of simplifying these three messages a little bit further so that you kind of take it with you and you don't forget about it. Every stakeholder should know their own why. Organic advocacy at every level and fast growth without breaking trust. With that, I appreciate your attention and looking forward if there is any questions and happy to answer.
Thanks, Shervin. I think one thing I'm curious about is when you say making sure everybody knows kind of their role and their why in the company, how do you handle, for instance, well, fundraising is a good example, or if you are in the acquisition process, a lot of these things, you're pretty limited in what you can tell people. And like you said, people tend to assume the worst if they don't hear from you what's going on and you kind of have some silence. Same thing can happen, right, in clinical trials where you're trying to ramp up the trial and there isn't a lot to share. How do you handle these kind of situations? Do you have any thoughts or recommendations?
Sure. I think part of it is that, a lot of the startups, when I wear my investor hat, actually are too concerned about this point, more concerned than they should be. So a lot of times, because they don't know what to share and what not to, they are also hesitant to even share things that are valuable. That's a very important point, because that kind of hesitancy can actually make them, lose the deal or losing partnership. So they have to be clear on what things should stay confidential and what things should be shared when with what type of person. If they need to sign NDA, that's fine too. But of course, for investment conversations, at least on the West Coast side, it's less common unless if you do a detailed due diligence, and that's a different story. But if that's required, that's important too. The other thing that I think I'm emphasizing here is to think of this as a major component that starts with your journey from day one. So naturally, you should have a lot of content and indirect evidence that shows, why your product is working. And this could be things that are talking about patient outcomes or how it helped the customer with even potentially get permission from them. Sometimes customers are open to be referenced for your investors. There are a lot of ways to do things. I don't think there is shortage of that, as long as you don't think about this the day you want to go after investors, because it will take some time. If you started from day one, I think your question basically proves that why this is needed to be done, early on.
Thank you, Shervin.
Thank you.